going on right now. And I appreciate everyone for showing him some support and love. I thank y'all for that.
This is so emotional.
Quincy, we've seen a lot of
This is so emotional. Yeah.
Quincy, we've seen so many protests around the world, including Australia, about what's happened to your father. A lot of people there are protesting about what's happened to Indigenous people of colour in custody in Australia. Do you have any message to them about what has happened?
I just want to thank them for supporting my family and receive justice for this.
How important is change? This is a pivotal moment in our country because of what happened to your father. How important is change? What do you want to see happen?
We need change. This can't happen to anybody else.
Okay.
Quincy, did you learn about the death of your father on TV like everybody else? Is that the first time you?
No.
His family notified him.
We love you, Quincy. We love you, man.
Thank you all.
We love you, Quincy.
Thank you very much.
What charges?
Okay. No, keep it right there. Keep it right there. Keep it right there.
What charges are you expecting today? What do you expect the three other officers to be charged with?
We are expecting these officers to be charged as accomplices for the killing of George Floyd. And hold on, I'll make sure everybody is quiet in the situation. He's not going to say anything else. Okay. All right. Let's keep them close. Let's come right behind us. Let's go.
Ben, talk to us about what we saw in that video, those three other officers, and why you believe they are complicit.
Obviously, as the police chief said, these officers are complicit by their silence, but we now know, based on the audio from their body cam video, that they also are accomplices because their failure to act when they knew that they did not have a post. Remember, one officer said, he doesn't have a post. Maybe we should turn him over on his side. However, Officer Chauvin said, no, we're going to keep him in that position. To us, that is intent. And that's why the family is calling for first-degree murder charges against Officer Chauvin for having his knee in his neck. And equally important is the fact that those two knees in his back for not 1 minute, not 2 minutes, not 3 minutes, not 4 minutes, not 5 minutes, not 6 minutes, not 7 minutes, not 8 minutes, but almost 9 minutes, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. George Floyd begged for air. He called out for Quincy's grandmother. He called out to anybody who would listen. And seemed like the lay people on the street were listening. The people who refused to listen were the people who were supposed to listen. It was supposed to be the police who were meant to protect and serve George Floyd, because George Floyd was an American citizen and George Floyd was a human being. George Floyd deserved humanity. And also, the system needed to be listening to George Floyd. Not just the police, but the prosecutors, the criminal justice system, the judges, the legislators, the president. America needed to be listening when George Floyd said, I can't breathe, because when he couldn't breathe, none of us could breathe. And so this is a tipping point. This is a tipping point. This moment is a tipping point to change America and see if America truly believes in the words of Thomas Jefferson, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equally, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst them are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Where America, that means black people too.
That's right. Say it.
Did that answer your question, George? Okay.
What do you say?
Two quick questions.
What do you say to the other 3 officers who did not intervene? What do you say to them?
You know, the family of George Floyd watched the video in agony. You've seen Philonis, you've seen Rodney, you've seen Bridget, you've seen Terrence, you've seen his children. They are horrified at what they witnessed on this video. I think every human being who has any humanity in them are horrified what they see on this video. The only question is, why weren't those police officers horrified? And so the family's statement to those police officers are they are just as guilty for the death of George Floyd as Officer Chauvin. They all participated. And when people tried to help, the officer took out mace. When Donald Williams and the EMT, the lay witness who were there, they threatened them that we won't let you give humanity. Even though we're not going to give humanity, we won't let you give George Floyd any humanity. And so the message is clear. Do your job to the people who are responsible for doing justice, because all the world is watching. 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 All the world is watching.
Question from the BBC. What do you think of the way the world has responded? What do you think of the way the world has responded, and also how America has responded?
The response of the world has been heartening to this family. Their entire family have been very heartening. They receive it as a blessing that George Floyd's life mattered to more than just them. It is very important to note who George was. There are videos on social media that George believed in peaceful protests. Brandon Williams, who was George's nephew, who was like a father to Brandon, said that they talked almost every day, and during the Ferguson protests, during the Baltimore protests, and just recently during the Sacramento protests, you had George Floyd praying for peaceful protests. You know, the forensic scientists, Dr. Michael Biden and Dr. Alicia Wilson, who did the family's autopsy, said that George died because he needed a breath. And so I am imploring, along with George Floyd's family, for all of us to take a breath. For peace, let's take a breath. For justice, let's take a breath to heal our country. And most importantly, let's take a breath for George Floyd as we get ready to memorialize him this week and lay him to his final rest on next Tuesday. Let's take a breath this week to heal the country and to remember George. Let's follow George's example. He would have wanted peaceful protests. He wants everybody to use their voice, but he wants them to do it in a constructive way. So as we get ready to memorialize him on tomorrow, at North Central University with all his family, I also want us to remember that Breonna Taylor, the young lady who was executed in the sanctity of her own home in Louisville, Kentucky, birthday would be on Friday. So let's take a breath for Breonna as well. Let's take a breath for Ahmaud Arbery as well. Let's take a breath for Terrence Crutcher as well. Let's take a breath for Pamela Turner, who was killed in Houston. Let's take a breath for Alton Sterling, who was killed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Let's take a breath for Philando Castile, who was killed here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Let's take a breath for Laquan McDonald, who was killed in Chicago, Illinois. Let's take a breath for Sandra Bland, who was killed in Texas. Let's take a breath for Natasha McKinney, who was killed by police in Virginia.
That's right.
Let's take a breath for Stephon Clark, who was killed in Sacramento, California. Let's take a breath for Corey Jones, who was killed in Palm Beach, Florida. Let's take a breath for Botham Jones, who was killed in his own apartment in Dallas, Texas. Let's take a breath for Eric Gardner, who was killed in Staten Island, New York. Let's take a breath for Freddie Gray, who was killed in Baltimore, Maryland. Let's take a breath for Walter Scott, who was killed in South Carolina. Let's take a breath for Jamar Clark, who was killed here in Minneapolis. Let's take a breath for
Tysell Nelson, North Side, Minneapolis. Tysell.
Let's take a breath for Michael Brown, who was killed in Ferguson. Let's take a breath for 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was killed in Cleveland, Ohio by the police. Let's take a breath for Trayvon Benjamin Martin, who was killed in Sanford, Florida. Let's take a breath for Emmett Till, who was killed in Mississippi. Let's take a breath collectively for all of the marginalized and disenfranchised and dehumanized people, whether black, brown, white, or red, who were killed unjustifiably, who were killed unnecessarily, and who was killed senselessly because they are American citizens, one, they are human beings, two, and finally, we should all remember they are children of God. Thank you so much. We will respond to you when we get the announcement.
Thank you, Crump. I'm not getting tired.